Hello there. Before we get started on today's episode, I'd like to ask a short favor. If you're interested in either of the two books that I have written and am about to release, head on over to my website at theanxioustruth.com/books. There you can learn about both books, one of which is free, and you can get on my mailing list to be notified when each book is released and how you can get it. I would really appreciate that. Okay, let's get rolling. Hey, what's up, everybody? Drew here from The Anxious Truth. I am joined today by a special guest, my friend Christa Holmans. Christa Holmans, that's right, I'm sorry. Christa, I found on Instagram where she is more popularly known as the Neurodivergent Rebel, which is like one of the greatest Instagram handles ever. And Christa is not only living the life of somebody on that autism spectrum, and you can correct me if I use wrong terminology. I would be okay with that because I'd like you to educate us a little bit. And you've been at this since 2016. Why don't you give us an idea of what you guys got going on at Neuro?
So I was diagnosed autistic. I was 29, so I went almost 30 years of my life having no idea I was autistic. But that being said, you always know something is different because you kind of go about your life being scolded for being a contrarian, despite that never being your intent. People, when you're missed, people don't know you're, thinking in a different way, and so they just assume you're being difficult all the time.
Right.
And when I finally found out, it was kind of like somebody gave me this like rule book for my life, like an instruction manual. It's like this aha moment that really, it set me on a new path. It really helped me start taking care of myself in a more autistic friendly way, because I had just been pushing myself and running myself into the ground trying to keep up with non-autistic standards, because I just thought I was a failed non-autistic person, because I couldn't do things that were easy for other people, despite, at the same time being able to do some really complex things that people struggle with easily. It's like it's two-sided coin, but it's like you really fixate on like what the little things that you suck at, unfortunately, because unfortunately, with anxiety, I'm sure you talk about here on this podcast, like those mistakes are under a magnifying glass, and you see them and like you ruminate on those sometimes. And so I kind of got myself into a frustrated spot before I was diagnosed. So that diagnosis kind of course corrected me in a much more positive and constructive direction that I needed to get myself on track.
Yeah. And which has led to this mission that you've got going on online. And I was saying before we started recording that you actually introduced me to the term neurodivergence, which I had never heard before. I will plead ignorance on that. And explain just for a second before we get into the conversation, what is neurodivergence? Like, what is the concept there? Because I think it's amazing and spectacular. So,
yeah. So basically, the concept of neurodiversity and neurodivergence, it's, like human diversity, there's and biodiversity. In nature, there's diversity. It's advantageous to have diversity. And so neurodiversity says there are different thinking styles that are just natural variations in the human, brain, people with ADHD or dyslexia, autistic people, myself, and, others, and there are sometimes Tourette's. It really depends on, what brain words autistic moment here. Anyway, sorry, I just completely had
so good.
A train wreck there. But basically, it just says that all of these brain types are here, and we should respect them and nurture them and help each of them to be the best, versions of themselves and best people they can be, basically.
Yeah. Which is a great message. I like the idea that it's not necessarily this is not a problem that we're necessarily trying to fix. It's just natural variation, and like everybody brings a little something different to the table. So, you even mentioned before, like some things you're really good at that maybe other people aren't. So like, let's not miss that. So very cool. So before we get into it, I was telling Christa before we started recording that this all started when somebody in my Facebook group asked if the methods that we talk about in the podcast to deal with anxiety and anxiety disorders, that whole facing, floating, accepting thing, going toward the fear, not reacting, all of those things, and unlearning the cognitive link between panic and danger, would those be helpful to an autistic person who's struggling? And I thought, I don't know how to answer that question, but I kind of thought you might have something to say about it. And that's how we got into this, like, hey, let's do a podcast together. So I would imagine that you were saying that, anxiety does come along with people that are on the autism spectrum. I mean, is it automatic for everybody, or is it, I mean, you're no different than anyone else. Like, you may have anxious days and not anxious days. Some things may cause anxiety, some may not, I'm sure. I'm guessing it's not automatic.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think we know a large number of autistic people report having issues with anxiety. But, the question is it natural for autistic people to have anxiety, or is that just a side effect of the unintentional gaslighting that a lot of us face in life? Because, especially, those of us who are undiagnosed, your whole life you're told you're just not trying hard enough, you're lazy, all these things, when you're trying your hardest and everyone around you is telling you you're just not trying hard enough. It just kind of breaks you down. Or, if you have sensory processing differences and other people around you don't, so you walk into the grocery store and the lights like literally burn your eyes like needles, and it hurts to walk into a Walmart, and you want to wear sunglasses inside, and people are like, no, you can't do that, or you're just being ridiculous, or why, you don't need that. And you just think, oh, okay, everyone else must be in pain too, and I guess they can tough it out and I'm just a wimp. You don't know. And then, sometimes people just don't understand that you're coming from a different perspective. And so there's a lot of misunderstandings, and that kind of breeds anxiety. So I don't know, if autistic people naturally have anxiety. I know I've had anxiety throughout my life for, I think, about as long as I can maybe remember. But I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer for that, or, for solutions, just like with non-autistic people.
Right. That's what I think. Like, I can't imagine that there'd be, there's that much difference, to be honest with you. Like, there's going to be variation in every segment of the population, including yours and mine. So what's, I would imagine that makes sort of sense. But so I think one of the things that you just mentioned that was super interesting is that thing where maybe you walk into a Walmart and the lights are so bright that for somebody who deals with that sort of sensory overstimulation problem, it can be a real issue. Now, that's also for people who suffer from anxiety disorders, that's also an anxiety symptom. But I have to start to wonder, because I've heard people come through, like my community surrounding the podcast, who have talked about that issue. Like, it feels like my brain is literally going to explode. I must run home and go into the dark. And it's super easy for everybody to say, oh, that's just an anxiety symptom. It's fine. Just accept it. Keep going. But once in a while, you'll hit that person that doesn't appear to be the answer. Like, no, you don't understand. Like, I literally feel like my brain is on fire, which is tough for us to hear sometimes, because I always say feels like is the biggest lie going. You can't live based on what it feels like, because anxiety will lie to you. It feels like you're dying when you're really not. But there are plenty of people who have indicated that, like, no, this feels like a real physical, overwhelming thing. And I have to wonder that if the experience of somebody who is autistic with a panic attack must be different to a certain extent. And I wonder, is the approach slightly different? So you dealt with anxiety. I don't know if you've actually dealt with an anxiety disorder like panic disorder or agoraphobia, but how have you found a way to cope? What have you done in your life?
See, this is great, because what you were just talking about, I've had panic attacks, and then a little bit more on like the overwhelm of the lights and other things. Sensory overload is something that is not only an autistic thing. And basically, in sensory overload, it is very similar to a panic attack in a lot of ways. But it's not anxiety triggered, although you can have anxiety about sensory overload, because it's terrible and it happens anytime you're going to go into certain situations.
Right.
But like sensory overload really is like the brain is just overloaded and it just can't process any more information. And so your brain does kind of start to shut down. And so what you have in sensory overload is, you kind of lose a bit of cognition first, and maybe you get a little slurry, or if you might notice things are weird. And then you start to kind of go downhill from there. And then if you don't get yourself out of the place, you might have almost an anxious reaction where it's like, get out of here, because your brain is like sending signals, run, get away, this is bad.
Yeah.
And, because then you really can just have overloaded your brain and you can't handle anymore. And so that's like sensory overload. And, like I said, it's not a specific autistic thing, but it is something that's more common with autistic people and happens more frequently with autistic people.
Mm-hmm.
And then panic attacks. Oh, they suck. I hate panic attacks.
I think we can all agree on that. I don't know anybody who loves them.
Oh, they suck so bad. And I've had both of those things, and they do feel a little bit similar. With the panic attack, it's so frustrating because, well, for many reasons. I think all the reasons it's frustrating. But it's definitely different triggers. Although I think I've had panic attacks thinking about having sensory overload, too much, because they're not fun. And when I got diagnosed autistic, I also got a social anxiety diagnosis. Although hindsight, I was kind of holding back a lot of things because there's a stigma about anxiety, mental health. Yeah. And I also didn't have the language to talk about anxiety and mental health because it was never considered or something that anyone talked about growing up. And generalized anxiety might have been more accurate, but I got the social anxiety diagnosis, and I was like, no, I don't even have anxiety, even though I had all the physical symptoms. Mm-hmm. I was having indigestion, sweaty palms, like all of it, physically. Yeah. But I was so used to operating at that level of high anxiety all the time.
That was your normal.
Normal, yeah. I had just put it all, and I've just stepped on it and used it all to climb up, and I was just used to it, and I was burning myself out. I was making myself sick, and that's why, I ended up being diagnosed because I had health problems related to the anxiety, and so I was, a sick autistic, and so I was, bad enough off mentally to where I represented what people think a stereotypical autistic looks like, because mental health professionals, they don't know what an autistic and good mental health looks like. The definition of an autistic person in the DSM is basically an autistic in crisis or an autistic person in bad mental health.
Okay, so what does it look like in a regular good day? Does anybody describe that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm like a normal human. I'm a normal person.
Right? Why wouldn't you be?
I'm a bit. And we're not all introverts either, but I'm a bit introverted. I'm a bit of a recluse. I need a lot of recharge time. Mm-hmm. I need a lot of downtime because when I go out in sensory environments like stores and, when I used to work in offices more, like it would really physically drain me down. And, now my employer lets me work remotely, and I can work a lot more hours remotely than I can when I have to physically go to an office and commute. And driving is one of the things that's easy for a lot of people that is really difficult for me. And I've put a lot of hours and miles on the road practicing it. I think it's always just going to be harder. And so not having to do that even just is such an amazing accommodation. But, a lot of people are hesitant to give those things because they're like, well, everybody wants that.
Yeah, but what I find fascinating about that is, I think, okay, so in your particular instance, there was a diagnosis of autism, and maybe there was some difficulties that went along with that, but there's probably a zillion people out there that would do much better if they didn't have to get in a car and drive for an hour and a half every day and to get to a job. So yeah, I don't know if that's necessarily a thing that where you'd single yourself out because of the diagnosis. Like, I think a lot of people would benefit from that in the end. But I like how you said that driving, I don't like that driving is a problem for you, but I mean, I like how you said that driving is a problem, but you have spent a lot of time practicing it. So like, this is a key theme that runs through my podcast and through the community around the podcast, never running away from the things that you fear. And I like that this has been a problem for you, but you do not appear to be backing away from it. I mean, it maybe your particular circumstance means it will always be difficult for you, but it doesn't sound like you've shied away from it though. You'll still do it.
Yeah, no. And, there was a point in my life, gosh, okay. I don't know when the switch happened because I wasn't always so willing to test my boundaries and push my fears. I wasn't. I know when I was, my best friend who I've known since, preschool, younger,
Yeah.
because she was next door neighbor growing up, and we were the same age. When some people, I've told them about my diagnosis, and they don't really know what to make of it because I don't fit their definition of what they think autism is, or they feel they've known me, or they know me really well, and to them this would change who I am in their eyes, and so they can't accept it. So people have a hard time accepting the information for a lot of different reasons. I'm learning, but she was in like elementary school with me and Girl Scouts with me and saw me with other people our age, and she's like, "Oh my gosh, this makes so much sense," which is so funny, right?
In hindsight.
In hindsight, yes. Oh my gosh, where was I going with this?
Well, yeah, it's okay. It was that thing where like you weren't always so willing to face your fears.
Yes, okay. Yeah. And so she was saying she remembers like once upon a time when I was a kid, I was like, this little person who like I couldn't do anything and that was because I was holding myself back. I was like afraid of everything. I had so much anxiety about everything and perfectionism, really bad, like being just afraid to just kind of pull it and let it go, and it's good enough and let it go. Just you can never accept when it's good enough. And at some point, I think I learned that if I wanted to learn something, I could learn it as long as I practiced, like really, really hard. And it took a lot of work, and I could eventually get there, and I learned, oh, wow, okay, through my stubbornness, I can do really amazing things. And that was a confidence booster. And then so I started being willing to try more and more risky things, even things that are really scary to me. Like one of the things I made myself do a few years ago at a team building at one of my last employers was like jump off of a platform, like 2-story platform, into a stunt bag, which I will never do again. Because one of my biggest fears is like falling.
Yeah, but you
did
it.
I did it. But in my head the entire time, like there was graphic images of how I was going to die because I did it wrong. And it was so terrible. But I was like, no, we're doing this anyway. But it was not fun. But I'm glad I did it, because I had to do it. But oh my gosh. And I had never felt my body was like so frozen and stiff. I couldn't even feel my body afterwards. It was like, oh. Yeah. But I want to, like, I learned a lot of the fear and the anxiety is not logical.
Oh, it's not logical in any way. There's nothing logical about it.
And so when I see something's not logical, or I'm like, okay, I'm not going to get hurt, or this actually isn't going to hurt me, or what's the worst that can happen? Right. I just have to just jump. And it's like, that's why I just tell myself in my head, this little pep talk, okay, just jump. Just jump. And I say that even like little things, like, like it's about to send an email to a client that I've read a million times. And I'm like, okay, is this good enough to send to this client? Is there a typo? Did I spell it? And I've looked at it, but it's like, okay, I just have to jump. I just have to hit send, and I just have to go. And because otherwise I can be paralyzed by my own anxiety and it won't let me move. And I just had to start pushing through it.
That's amazing, because obviously you're on a slightly different journey, possibly for different reasons, but you have described exactly what so many people who listen to me are trying to do. Now, maybe they're trying to get to the point where they can get back out the door or drive on the highway again because their world is shrinking because of panic and agoraphobia and things of that nature. But it's always that thing where, well, I know logically that I shouldn't be afraid to go into the supermarket, yet I am, and I can't do it. And the only way, we talk about all the time, the only way to actually be able to go into the supermarket is to go into the supermarket. You'll never be able to talk your way out of the fear. You must show yourself that you are okay. And so you're describing such a very similar process. Like, just got to jump. And at some point, people who are dealing with these problems also have to just take that leap of faith that, like, I'm going to be okay. Even though I think in their case, they're panicked to the point where they think they may die or go insane and that sort of stuff. But you still have to take a leap of faith and know that that stunt bag is there to catch you, and you're okay. And you learn through experience that it's okay. So your willingness to go and do those hard things and scary things mirrors the experience of a person who is recovering from an anxiety disorder. It's really amazing. Yeah, that was great. That was really, really, really helpful. So I think we don't want to go too long. We're going to try and keep it under 30 minutes. So we got about 10 more minutes to go. So the things that you have learned to do to adapt in terms of, you didn't even know you had anxiety, which is amazing to me. You just thought that was your normal. Like, my palms are supposed to sweat. My heart is supposed to pound out of my chest. That's just normal, right? So So did it not take a lot of adaptation or work to overcome the anxiety issues? Or once you had a label for it, it became easier, or they're still there? I mean, how did you wind up working through all that?
So I started working through it before I knew what it was and before it had a name, I think,
Okay.
because I knew something was wrong. Not related to autism, but the anxiety. Something was wrong.
Right.
And so I had been seeking out lots of things, and I would bury myself in exercise. And then I got really, really into yoga, and that was amazing. Not just the physical part, because there's a very spiritual and lots of breathing and mindfulness with yoga, and that was so good to me. And then it led me to Buddhism. And so as an autistic person, for me, and we're all different, but in a very stereotypical way, like lists and handful checklists of things are so useful to me. And this Buddhism was this very practical system of getting your brain right and kind of calming your wild mind that's all over the place.
Right.
And so I started, with a lot more mindfulness and Buddhism and meditation. And for me, that was really helpful. But the breathing exercises the most, and, being more aware of, oh, here's that feeling again. And it's, observing, what does this feeling feel like? I know it's going to pass, all of that stuff, just being with it. But I learned that, before I had a name for what I was even dealing with. I started to do those things because I was I knew it gave me relief, and I hadn't had relief my entire life. I'd always been, or at least for as long as I could remember, I'd been just amped up, anxious. I'm a million miles an hour kind of a person anyway. So that was really helpful. And then when I was diagnosed autistic, and then I started to, learn more about anxiety, because a lot of autistic people have anxiety for whatever reason. And I started to be more involved in kind of autism and then mental health community. And I learned more about anxiety, and I was like, okay, I have a lot of anxiety, I started to realize. And I started to really deal with it, really deal with it.
Yeah.
Which is, giving it a name helped so much. Yeah, go ahead.
It sounds like you developed a lot of the same tools that we talk about all the time on the podcast, and people that are in this process of overcoming these anxiety disorders, the difference between anxiety and anxiety disorder, use all the same tools: the meditation, the mindfulness, the breathing exercises, not because they're shields against panic and anxiety, but they're focusing tools, they're mind calming tools, they're quieting tools, puts you back in the driver's seat a little bit. So it sounds like you had a similar experience with those particular tools that they've helped you out, which is great. And I think I want to get to a couple of the questions that people had asked that maybe you can shed some light on. There wasn't a whole lot, but one person had, well, I'm going to ask a question first. My question first.
Yeah.
It's my podcast, so I get to ask first. So the question would be, and I've had many people that follow me and listen to the podcast, they're dealing with their children are having anxiety problems, and they're looking for help with their children, which is great, or other family members, and some of which are also diagnosed autistic, or they have other neurodivergence issues, if you will. And I know, they worry sometimes. I've got that. Well, how does this complicate it for my son or my daughter? And I don't know. I'm guessing there's no blanket answer to that because of diversity within every community, of course. But do you have an opinion on that? Is there a wrinkle here? Yeah.
It's hard when you're helping, especially if you're helping, your kids and they're younger. With autistic kids, it's with anxiety, it can even be OCD level sometimes, or we tend to be at least I am. I'm really fixated on problems, and I see a problem and it's big and it's glaring me in the face.
Okay.
And it's I can't ignore it until I've checked it off that it's taken care of and it's good and it's safe. Okay. And as a kid, I would tell my mom things like, oh, I can't get out of the bathtub. I'll slip and I'll crack my head open and I'll bleed to death and I'll die. And my mom thinks I'm being dramatic because I'm this logical kid. Why would I really think that would happen? I was for way longer than it should be. My mom had to pick me up and take me out of the bathtub. But I was really convinced, I'm also a very visual thinker. So thoughts in my head are, I close my eyes and it's like a VR 360 movie. I can see it clearly. And so I could see very clearly what I had imagined in my head happening, and it was real to me. And I was
Yeah.
convinced that that was gonna happen to me. And but people from the outside don't understand like how real that is.
Right. Right.
Um,
Which may be more of
and
a wrinkle because of your position on that spectrum, possibly. Is that what you're intimating? I'm not sure.
yeah, and it's tricky because autistic people, a lot of like we think and we experience the world and our emotions often in a more intense way.
Hmm.
And so, situations for us that aren't as overwhelming for others can be more overwhelming for us. And, um, we tend to ruminate on things. Our obsessive nature, is good and it's a gift and it's a curse.
Right.
Like I have, I said I can get really good at anything I want to learn, for the most part.
Right.
I failed miserably when I was trying really hard to be non-autistic and keep up with my peers in the workplace that weren't. I couldn't
Wow.
do it.
Yeah.
And that hurt my self-esteem because I hadn't ever tried to do something and failed since I had realized, oh, I can do anything I put my mind to if I try hard enough, and then I failed. But I got the diagnosis. I was like, oh, it's okay. I wasn't meant to.
Yeah.
But it's just trying to keep moving forward, but it's hard. When we get, that obsessiveness can be such a bad thing at the same time.
Yeah. And so it sounds like it may actually, and for people who are not on the spectrum, just, with dealing with these disorders, those thoughts and obsessions and fears do feel so real and so powerful. And it sounds like maybe it's even amped up a bit more for you or someone in your position. So I think that's an understanding that the rest of us should probably keep in our pockets. Like, as hard as it is for you, it may even be more difficult for a person in that position to really make that leap of faith into the fear, because the fear feels even more intense as it does for somebody else. The thought is deeper ingrained. It repeats more, all those things.
Well,
Sounds
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, just think about that. If our memories are already like 360 VR experiences, think about like PTSD and PTSD flashbacks. That's what people get with PTSD, right?
Right,
Kind of
right.
almost like a flashback situation.
Right.
And so, autistic people who are really keened into their senses and really like hooked on senses, like can be triggered to really haunting traumatic memories from scents and touch and
Yeah.
a song. And, we're suddenly like back. I have memories of being 1.5 years old, just as clear as yesterday.
Yeah.
But my short-term memory is really tricky and annoying, and I have to write so many notes down because I can't take written instructions. I won't remember what you need me to do. It's frustrating how that works. But it's like I can remember so many things like it was just yesterday. So it's not like time really makes the memories go away. There's not a really normal time-space continuum in my head. It's all like it was just yesterday.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. So I think it would probably be a more patient approach. It would more patience and maybe a little bit more time and a bit more of a, I'm not going to say a gentle approach, because if anything I know of you, it's never a victim. There's never a victim mentality in your world I could see, which is awesome. But, I think a reality check is always a good thing. So one question that came up that a lot of people seem to like was, when on the spectrum, how can you prevent the natural overstimulation that you may experience from becoming anxiety? So, and we maybe talked about that a little bit in the beginning. We were talking about that sensory overload thing, but a lot of people seem to love that question. So if you're naturally stimulated more than I might be, for instance, how do you keep that from becoming, a heightened state of anxiety or even panic? For the people who are listening to me, they're likely thinking, how do I keep this from turning into yet another panic attack? Or do you,
Well, I think, first you have to kind of learn to recognize, maybe keep notes and figure out what your triggers are. What is triggering these episodes? Is it this store? Is it every time I go to these kinds of stores? What stores is it? You can narrow down, is it a lighting thing? Is it a sound thing? Is it, because for all of the senses with autistic people or people with sensory processing differences or SPD, any of the senses, like a radio dial or a volume knob can be dialed up or down. If we say middle is normal, normal, whatever normal is. And so it can be more intense or less intense depending on which way you dial it. And that's for taste and sound and smell. And so, you know, if you're just overwhelmed with any of these senses, eventually your brain is just like, ugh. So you want to start to learn to recognize, like, at the first sign of something's wrong, I'm starting to feel like I'm not myself, or, you know, that, okay, I need to maybe remove myself or go engage in something that is the opposite of overstimulating the brain, something that's relaxing, you know, go color a coloring book, go
Right.
play with some silly putty, go, you know, go sniff some essential oils, go do something that is soothing, go lay on a couch with a weighted blanket. Oh my God, I love my weighted blanket. It's the best, you know, just go, you know, go cuddle a puppy, you
Yeah.
know, but you need to learn, like, oh, I'm getting overloaded and I need to rest. And then for me as an autistic person, I've had to learn that I'm really all or nothing. I have no off switch. Like I will go until I finish something if I don't block in self-care and rest time. So I make a point to like schedule my downtime because I really need downtime. You know, say if I know I'm going to be traveling and I've got a bunch of trips, like in October, I went to, you know, a few different cities and I was on like so many different airplanes that month. And it's like, okay, so I had to like block in, this is a rest day. I am not doing anything that day. And it's like, I'm not allowed to work this day. I'm going to maybe watch some Netflix
Yeah.
and, you know, cuddle with the puppies and eat some popsicles and hang out at home and not work, you know, just downtime.
Yeah.
Because it's like the brain is overstimulated, so that you have to like constantly be aware of that and be thinking about, okay, what is good for me that is the opposite of overstimulation that can kind of balance that out.
Yeah.
And so learning yourself, that takes a lot. That's probably the biggest task, is learning yourself and learning your triggers.
So interesting, because some of what you described, which makes perfect sense, and obviously you figured a lot of these things out through trial and error for yourself, probably, they would be cardinal sins in my world. Like, so you go into the supermarket and you're feeling overwhelmed, and you are correct, like in your situation, but you are actually perceiving it that way. Your perception of that environment is different than mine. And so you must act on the fact that it is a different perception, whereas we would normally tell somebody, nope, you just have to relax into that and stay. And when you run, you learn that the supermarket is dangerous, but that's not what you're doing. Like, you are literally adapting to the reality. It is a reality for you. It's not in your head. It's not a false fear. That is the reality of how you perceive the world. So
But we've been told it's in our heads a lot.
that must have been
we're
incredibly
sensitive.
frustrating. It must have been.
Yes.
Yes. And so I think if there's one person listening to us that maybe hasn't been diagnosed or doesn't know, isn't sure, there was some question, I know that there are people that probably are trying to do this thing that I talk about doing, where like, no, you don't leave the situation because that's the wrong thing to do, who maybe really should leave the situation if they are truly perceiving it that way. It's such a fascinating thing. So it adds a bit of a fine line to walk. You need to get out of the situation and then learn the proper way, I guess, to be able to do that task, as opposed to just never doing the task again.
And here's some other, you know, maybe tips too. You know, if you find out that it's like overstimulation from light or overstimulation from sound, then okay, get some, what is it, the silent headphones?
Yep. Or even the sonic earplugs you can use at a concert, you know, that sort
or
of thing.
sunglasses, and wear
Absolutely.
those inside, and then
Sure.
see if you feel less anxious, see if you feel better.
Right.
And that's the hard thing. It's like people like worry, oh, if they look funny going into stores with these things on.
Yeah.
But if it makes you feel better, and you know, I started doing these things and I was like, oh my gosh, just having sunglasses on going into Lowe's and Walmart, I'm like, I don't hate being in here anymore.
Wow.
We can run around and goof off in Walmart. And
that's a big deal what you just said, because I think that's a good litmus test. So somebody who's saying like, I don't know, I just feel like I can't do it. If you put on those sunglasses and suddenly Walmart becomes much, much easier, then that's probably a really good chance that says that, yes, you are truly experiencing that visual overstimulation. Somebody in the throes of an anxiety disorder who is not on the spectrum puts on the sunglasses and it doesn't matter. Something else will make them fearful. So the sunglasses will not help. So it's such an interesting thing to think about. Like, it adds a wrinkle. You know, you still have to learn to take care of yourself and go shopping and do those errands and everything, but you have to be aware of how you're perceiving the world, I guess, what the triggers are, and then how to adapt to those things.
Mm-hmm.
It's awesome. It's tremendously helpful. Tremendously helpful.
Oh, glad.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess we'll kind of wrap it up. There was one other question that somebody asked, but you kind of brought it up again. This person says, I was diagnosed with ADD late in the game, and after years of anxiety disorder, she was conflicted, like chicken and egg issue. Do I have ADD or do I have an anxiety disorder? Do I have both? Which came before the other? But I don't know. Does it really even matter in the end? I did have some symptoms early in childhood. I didn't have true poor memory and agitation until she became agoraphobic. So it all became a kind of a jumbled mess for this person where, wait, do I have ADD and an anxiety disorder? Do I have one or the other? And it became hard for her, I guess, to keep them separate or pry them apart. I don't know if you have found that in your situation or dealt with people where it all gets mixed up. Oh, great, another diagnosis.
Yeah, well, and what's interesting is with neurodiversity, a lot of the conditions are commonly co-occurring with one another, like autism. I don't have ADHD. One of my closest friends is ADHD, and I have a lot of ADHD friends, like just naturally. I don't know. I gravitate towards the ADHDers. It's like it's not, we're neurodivergent. We can feel it. Yeah, my people, yes. But with autism or ADHD, it is something that it's a lifelong diagnosis. You don't age out of it, you age into it. Kind of, you grow into it, you mature into it, and you learn to cope, or you don't, and you kind of you change as you grow. But the way you think doesn't really ever change, and it's hard to say too. But because with autism and then with ADHD. There's always, the possibility of misdiagnosis or whatever. But, with ADHD, I think anxiety is kind of a common, co-occurring thing too, if I'm not mistaken, because I know a lot of my ADHD friends are also anxiety people.
Yeah.
We're really similar. And what's really interesting is in a lot of ways, I almost feel sometimes like it's hard to tell autistic kids and ADHD kids apart. We're so similar sometimes. I think the ADHD kids are a little bit more outgoing sometimes, but even autistic kids can be really outgoing and sociable, believe it or not. Especially, so it's like people just don't understand, I was the one I was really outgoing and really social, and I didn't realize when the other kids were picking on me. I thought, because I just thought, oh, they'd be nice, they'd be my friends. I wouldn't get it when they were being manipulative little monsters. Like, it would just be totally over my head.
Right. Interesting. So I think it's, in the end, it all starts to tie together, right? Everybody exhibits traits of everyone else's issue. The little autism, ADHD kind of fit together. People who have anxiety disorders exhibit some of those traits, although they're under distress at the moment, but would be easily, kind of confused for somebody who has ADHD. So in the end, my answer to that sometimes is, what does the diagnosis matter? Now, in your case, the diagnosis did matter because it answered a ton of questions, but people struggle sometimes with like, well, I don't know what I am. So this diagnosis is either a death sentence for me, or not a death sentence, but now I'm locked into this. This is what I am. And I think they worry about that. So that's probably what fueled that question. But in the end, you learn to adapt and live and build your skill set that you got to build. And what does it matter in the end? Sometimes,
that's why I like neurodiversity too, because it's, it says all of these different brain types exist and are here. And, sometimes it's easier for people to say, I feel like I'm neurodivergent in some way.
Yeah.
And I feel like I'm neurodivergent. I mean, there's a lot of different things that within that, but it's like, I feel, but you can know, like, I have a different brain type. I can tell, because when you've kind of gone about the world and have been scolded your whole life for being a weirdo, and you were just like, I'm just normal me. What are you talking about?
Yeah, certainly not a weirdo. So this has been great. We're at almost 40 minutes, so we'll wrap it up here. Yeah, I know. We kept going. We kept drawing away. I would do this again with you in a heartbeat. So I appreciate your time. You were like incredibly helpful to the people who are listening, I know. So before we go, where can people find you?
Yes. So neurodivergentrebel.com is probably the easiest place. I'm on all social media platforms as Neurodivergent Rebel. I'm pretty easy to track down.
Yeah, you are. You're pretty visible. which I dig. Yeah, I dig. And you should definitely follow Christa because the message is out. I just love it. Anyway, that's me. So I appreciate your time. Maybe we'll do it again one day. And yeah, that's it. I'll stop the recording and then we'll wrap it up. Thank you,
Awesome.
Christa.
Thank you.
All right. See you guys next time. Hey, what's up, guys? Drew here. In the 5 years that I've done the podcast, I've never had a sponsor. But now it's time for me to put in a little plug for the day job, the business that I own. And that business is managed WordPress hosting. So if you have a website and it runs WordPress, and you'd like WordPress hosting that makes WordPress faster, more secure, and way easier than you ever imagined it would be, then check out Helix. You can find us online at iamhelix.com. That's IAMHELIX.com. We took a long time to build Helix. I'm super proud of it. It works spectacularly. We take really good care of our customers, and I promise we would take really good care of you too. So if you're in the market for WordPress hosting that will blow your mind, check out Helix. I would appreciate the consideration. I thank you for coming by and listening, and I'll see you the next time.